President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I join my colleagues today in standing up for Americans' basic constitutional rights. Donald Trump has again deployed agents and troops to my... Ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, Donald Trump has again deployed agents and troops to my hometown of Portland, Oregon, and to other American cities. He announced this authoritarian occupation with orders for federal agents to use, and I quote, full force. Since then, he's deployed federal law enforcement from the Department of Homeland Security, and he's activated 200 Oregon National Guard members over the objection of the governor of Oregon, local leaders in Portland, and local law enforcement. He has tried to deploy an additional 300 troops from California, the National Guard there, and 400 troops from the Texas National Guard, all to my hometown. Colleagues, during this government shutdown, our Guard members will not even be paid for this unnecessary, unwanted deployment. Activating the Oregon National Guard alone is going to cost $10 million and will pull Guard members away from much more important work. If Donald Trump truly wanted to help Oregon or Illinois or California, the money would be better spent cracking down on fentanyl traffickers, ending his tariffs that are gutting small businesses, and holding down health costs. Instead, Donald Trump says U.S. cities like Portland ought to be used as training grounds for the military. I'd say to the Senate, let that one sink in. The President of the United States thinks it's acceptable to use American cities as training grounds for the military. In my view, that's unconscionable. My hometown is a vibrant and peaceful city. It doesn't require any deployment of federal troops or additional federal agents to keep our communities safe. In fact, the federal judge who was appointed by Donald Trump himself has ruled repeatedly against the troop deployment. She said there was no showing that military help is necessary to protect law enforcement or the one federal building for ICE. Portland's police department has said there's no need for federal agents in our city as well, and that the administration's deployment of ICE agents is making it actually harder for them to do their jobs and keep our city safe. The notion that my hometown is somehow a war zone in need of saving is a fantasy made up by Donald Trump and far-right trolls. Oregonians have taken to social media to show that my community is really peaceful. You see it in our gardens and our vegetable stands. You see it in musicians playing on the sidewalks. My constituents have long engaged in peaceful First Amendment activity. The governor and the mayor of Portland have the appropriate resources to maintain peace and order in our communities. My view is this Trump unilateral action is an abuse of executive authority. He is clearly hoping that he can incite violence and undermine the constitutional balance of power between the federal government and our states. In addition to the judicial ruling in Oregon last month, a federal judge in California ruled that the Trump administration actually violated black-letter law through the deployment of troops to Los Angeles. His Los Angeles deployment violated the Posse Comitatus Act. That explicitly limits the power of the federal government to use the military for domestic purposes. Unfortunately, Mr. President, none of this is new to my hometown. 5 years ago, Portland experienced the consequences of an unnecessary and outrageous federal deployment under Donald Trump's first presidency. In the summer of 2020, the White House unleashed federal agents on Portland. It was like an occupying army, complete with military-grade equipment and violent tactics that were totally unacceptable on American soil. Federal agents shot at Portland residents, tear-gassed families, drove in unmarked vehicles, and grabbed people off the street without an explanation. Federal agents didn't identify themselves. They didn't wear uniforms. They beat up on those who asked them basic questions about their actions. There is no question in my mind that another deployment by this administration is going to result in similar abuses, similar violations of Americans' constitutional rights. Inciting violence is clearly Donald Trump's intent. And I want to make it clear, as Oregon's senior senator, I'm going to continue doing everything to work with my colleagues to fight back against Trump's federal occupation and show America from coast to coast the beauty and the strength of my hometown. I yield the floor, and I note my partner in the Oregon congressional delegation, Mr. President. He and I have teamed up every step of the way, and will continue to do so, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Chair recognizes the senator from Oregon.
I think my colleague from Oregon has laid out the situation very well. An authoritarian president emboldened by a rubber-stamped Congress, emboldened by a deferential Supreme Court, is sending military troops against American citizens who are peacefully protesting in city after city. This is un-American. It's a fundamental violation of the purpose of our military, which is to defend us from foreign powers, not to be a tool in a president's hand to attack people who disagree with his point of view. That happens in countries that don't have a president but have a king, that have a dictator. That's not our tradition here. Our whole entire Constitution is about government by and for the people, not by and for a man at the top of the executive branch using military against his own citizens. By law, federalizing National Guard is quite limited. It can only be done unless it's done in partnership with the governor, if there is an invasion, or if there is a rebellion. At the time these laws were written, it was well understood exactly what those are. An invasion, just what you picture. A military force on our border, about to cross that border and attack the United States of America, or they've already crossed the border. That's an invasion. A rebellion, a large group, well organized, well weaponized, that is trying to overturn the government of the United States of America. At the very start of our republic, there was a rebellion called the Shays Rebellion. A whole group in the northeastern part of our country were very upset about the challenges they were facing as farmers. They got organized, and they had weapons, and they were shutting down the courts that were doing foreclosures on their farms, and they were seeking access to a federal armory. Shays Rebellion, large group, well organized, weaponized, trying to overturn the government. The last time we saw a rebellion in the United States of America was when President Trump, in his first term, organized a mob to attack this Capitol to prevent the votes from being counted in the Electoral College. That would meet the test of a rebellion. But peaceful protesters holding signs of concern about the policies of this president or the actions of one of his agencies, that's freedom of speech. That's freedom of assembly. That goes to the core of who we are as Americans. Well, obviously, there's nothing approaching an invasion or a rebellion in the city of Portland. Senator Wyden and I were outside of ICE a couple weekends ago. I saw 3 women in a group holding a couple signs. Right now, there is a group called Pause for Peace, who are getting together with puppy dogs, and the pause is PAWS. Creative, Portland-style protesting, saying they're not happy with the administration. I don't think a bunch of folks holding their puppy dogs constitutes a well-organized, well-armed group trying to overthrow the government. And then there's another group that's called Pastries and Pajamas. And they're out there in the morning handing out pastries to people. They're in their pajamas, encouraging peaceful protesting. They may disagree with the administration, but what they're exercising is as American as an apple pie or an apple pie pastry, making their voice known. But Trump decided he wanted to create a riot in Portland. Why does he want to create a riot in Portland? Because he wants a violent encounter in order to justify putting the military into our cities. In other words, put the military into the cities to create a riot and then use that as a justification for the military being in the cities. That is extraordinary risk to our republic. That is an extraordinary risk to people, a government of, by, and for the people. And not just in Portland, but in LA, in DC, in Chicago. What the instructions appear to be to his federal agents is to provoke violence by attacking peaceful protesters. The Oregonian, the major newspaper in our state, did a report in which they said their staff witnessed the federal agents attacking peaceful protesters. I thought that was a very unusual article. It wasn't the newspaper reporter saying people present at the protest alleged that the federal agents attacked peaceful protesters. No, it said our staff witnessed this. And then there's Oregon Public Broadcasting. Oregon Public Broadcasting was down there with videographers, and what they witnessed was this. The federal agents asked the protesters to move back several blocks, and they did, and there was no conflict between the protesters and the federal agents. Behind this line of federal agents were videographers. Why were the videographers right behind the line of federal agents? Well, very interesting thing happened. After the protesters moved back not just 1 block or 2 blocks, but 3 blocks, and the federal agents have a line across the street with the videographers right behind it, upon command, the federal agents threw down tear gas. They threw down these bang snap devices that sound like gunfire going off, flashbangs they're called, light and sound, sounds like gunfire, and pepper balls. And of course, you suddenly have a cloud of smoke. You're hearing gunfire, what sounds like gunfire, and people are retreating from the tear gas. And they were taking videos of that, trying to say they were disrupting a riot. They were dispelling a riot. This is like Wag the Dog, where a totally artificial war is reported. Only in that case, it's happening overseas. This is the first time that I know of in American history that a president has staged a fake riot to try to convince the courts or one of his news stations that serve him so well that something is there that isn't there, that a riot is there when it's not there. Any true-blooded patriot of the United States of America should be terrified that we have a government faking a riot to try to be able to justify sending troops into our cities. That's what we face right now. This picture to my right, this was witnessed by the news media. They put this up, and you had a woman who was talking to 2 officers She had not disobeyed any command they had given her, or there was no physical confrontation. A third agent walks up holding pepper spray in his hand, and after a few seconds, fully unleashes it straight into her face and to the man standing next to her. That's the type of assault from these federal agents occurring on peaceful protesters, recorded by the news media and reported, not something from some bystander who happened to put the scene up on TikTok, who didn't witness the entire thing or understand what was happening, but from the major news media. And here's a case in Chicago. A pastor, in the traditional motion of praying and blessing, is standing outside the building by himself, no obvious resistance to any kind of command, and he is shot in the head from agents on top of the building. He reports that he was hit twice in the head and I think 5 times on the body. Wow. These folks unleashing rapid-fire attack, apparently with pepper balls, or as he described it, some kind of ammo that releases some kind of chemical. Taken right down to the street by this attack. For praying, attack by federal agents on a pastor praying in front of a building. This is an extraordinarily dangerous moment in which an authoritarian president is proceeding to attack due process, to attack freedom of speech, to attack freedom of the press, to weaponize the Department of Justice, using it against those who disagree with him, and then seeking to get the court's permission to send the military into the streets to attack people who are peacefully protesting who disagree with him. We are at the moment right now where we're awaiting a decision from a panel of 3 judges in the Ninth Circuit. The district judge who adjudicated the effort by Trump to federalize the Oregon National Guard said there's nothing close to rebellion, there's nothing close to an invasion, so the standard is not met. And then President Trump said, I'm going to send the federalized force from California and Texas to Oregon. And in fact, I gather 100 agents arrived from California. And the same judge said the same standard applies. There would, regardless of what happened that federalized those folks in California or Texas, the question is there a rebellion or invasion in Oregon? And there is not. And so she put a temporary stay on it. The Ninth Circuit said, we're going to take a look at this, so we're just going to freeze things in place. And those Oregon National Guard and those 100 from California are going to stay at a training ground until they make their ruling. Their ruling, they held a hearing today, maybe tomorrow, maybe days from now, we don't know. And of course, that will be appealed to the Supreme Court. And there are legal scholars who are saying, here's the challenge. Although there's an objective standard in the law, we have a Supreme Court that has already invented things that are not in the Constitution, interpreted things in a way that they were totally different from what they considered at the time the law was written. So the Supreme Court may say, in spite of the fact that there is an objective standard for federalizing National Guard, the Supreme Court may say, we're simply deferring to the president. Are you kidding me? This is a fundamental issue in the United States of America, that the military not be used against American citizens. There's a standard in the law. So Supreme Court, wake up. Do your job in the framework of the Constitution and in the framework of the laws that were passed, quit inventing things to create an authoritarian state. Why am I so worried that our Supreme Court has gone so far off track? Because last year they found invisible ink in the Constitution. They had a case, Trump versus the United States of America. And in that case, the question was, is the president above the law? Is the president immune from any potential criminal prosecution for acts that he deems acts of the government? And I thought, well, absolutely not, of course. Our founders were terrified that a president would become a king. If they wanted the president immune from prosecution, they could have put that in the Constitution. Can you find that in the Constitution? Can any of my colleagues on the left side of the aisle or the right side of the aisle show me that in the Constitution? It's not there, because our founders were that worried about a president becoming a king. So they did not give the president immunity from prosecution. But the Supreme Court did, because they thought that's too big a burden for the president to bear. They thought, in our judgment, we think it's a good idea to give the president protection so he doesn't have to stay up late at night worrying whether he's creating a crime or not. Well, let me tell you, the Constitution says policy is written here in the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives down the hall. And that becomes policy when the president signs it. Policy is not the purview of the Supreme Court of the United States. They're supposed to be defending the Constitution. The officer, or the pastor, said, "It was clear to me that the officers were aiming for my head. Shot 7 times with pepper balls in the face and arms and torso, without warning, a Presbyterian pastor." That's what our country is coming to, an assault on anyone who stands up and exercises freedom to share their opinion. Aren't there 100 senators here who stand for freedom? Why is there not one senator across the aisle standing for freedom here on the floor of the Senate today? Not one. Why? Why is there not one senator standing up and saying there's no clause in the Constitution that makes the president a king, immune from prosecution for crimes committed under the law? Why is there not one senator across the aisle saying we will not stand for the attack on due process, the attack on freedom of speech? I assure you, if there was a president saying to Fox News, you have to take a program off the air that president doesn't like, every senator across the aisle would be standing up and saying that's a breach of freedom of speech. I'd be standing up and saying the same thing, just as I am now, because it shouldn't matter whether it's a right-leaning or a left-leaning network. They should be able to put on air what they want. That's what freedom of the press is. So we've seen 9 months of this president making this country sicker and poor. 9 months of personal corruption, selling access to himself through his crypto enterprises. 9 months of covering up the Epstein files that he doesn't want released because his name is in them. 9 months of slashing health care for families to fund tax breaks for billionaires. 9 months of cutting nutrition for children to fund tax breaks for billionaires. A bill passed this body that runs up $30 trillion in additional debt over 30 years to fund tax breaks for the richest Americans. It's a families lose, billionaires win vision, and it's the wrong vision here in a republic where we celebrate government by and for the people. Because in a republic that is exercising appropriately, it would be a families thrive and the affluent and powerful pay their fair share. That's the vision that all of us should be pursuing. The fact that this horrific bill came out and passed, the big, ugly Betrayal of Americans Act, slashing health care in order to fund more riches for the richest among us, that shows you it's not working right. And what's really not working right is that the President of the United States is deploying military forces, hoping to establish that it's okay to do so, that they're okay for them to set orders to go out and attack our cities, to attack peaceful protesters, that he will get a court decision that gives him this power. Colleagues, let's be 100 strong behind the vision of freedom, the vision of rights for Americans, and say, hell no. Thank you, Mr. President.